In the early months of 1962, something had begun to gnaw at the executives and engineers deep within Chrysler Corporation's headquarters in Detroit. The automotive world was moving fast, faster than Chrysler had anticipated. Pontiac was dominating the drag strips, taking championships, breaking records, and most importantly, capturing the hearts and wallets of young American car buyers. The muscle car revolution was building momentum, and Pontiac seemed to be leading the charge. For Chrysler, this wasn't just a matter of performance bragging rights. It was about survival in a market that was rapidly becoming obsessed with power, speed, and the kind of raw automotive theater that only a drag racing victory could provide. Somewhere in those concrete corridors of corporate power, someone made a decision that would change the trajectory of not just Chrysler's racing efforts, but the entire sport of drag racing itself. They tasked their engineers with an impossible mandate: create a new engine powerful enough to dominate the drag strips and racetracks by the spring of 1964. They had less than 16 months. What made this deadline so brutal wasn't just the technical challenge. It was the fact that they were asking engineers to build something that had never really been done before in the world of American motorsport. They needed an engine that could handle the punishment of extended competition while making horsepower numbers that seemed almost theoretical at the time. The 426 Max Wedge, Chrysler's current weapon of choice, was a formidable piece of machinery, but it had limitations. A wedge-shaped combustion chamber, while economical to manufacture, simply couldn't breathe the way a hemispherical design could. The Max Wedge was aging, and everyone knew it. What Chrysler needed was revolution, not evolution. The man who would lead this charge was Tom Hoover, an engineer who understood that sometimes the best solution isn't a completely new idea, but rather a brilliantly executed combination of existing technologies. Hoover had proven his mettle with his work on the Max Wedge, and now, in December of 1962, he sat down with a small team of engineers, draftsmen, dyno operators, and technicians under the direction of Willem Veertman, Chrysler's manager of engine design. Their assignment was clear. They needed to marry the bulletproof deep skirt block of the 426 Max Wedge with hemispherical cylinder heads, the very heads that had proven themselves on the older 392 cubic inch engines. The result would be an entirely new power plant, the 426 HEMI. Hoover's insight was deceptively simple but profoundly powerful. The hemispherical combustion chamber, with its near-perfect geometry and opposing valve arrangement, could move air more efficiently than any wedge design. The larger intake and exhaust valves could be angled outward on a dome, creating a shape that nature itself seemed to favor for burning fuel. The more complete combustion meant faster power strokes, which meant more usable horsepower across the rev range. But there was a catch, and this is what separated the good engineers from the great ones. A hemispherical head was larger and heavier than a wedge head, and it created thermal stress zones that could cause pre-ignition and knock. You needed a block that could handle that punishment. You needed something that could take a beating. The deep skirt block of the 426 Max Wedge was exactly that. It had massive material underneath the main bearing saddles, creating an incredibly rigid foundation that could absorb the violent forces of high-compression combustion and sustained high RPM operation. When you mated that block with a proper HEMI head, you didn't just get an engine, you got an anvil that could breathe. This wasn't radical thinking. It was engineering common sense executed with brilliant precision. By early 1964, the 426 HEMI was ready for its debut. Chrysler had managed the impossible. In less than 14 months, they had created an engine that would change the sport forever. When the HEMI showed up at the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona, the reaction was immediate. The engine was dominant, but not because of raw numbers on paper, because of what it could actually do on the track. That year, the 426 HEMI made its presence known at every major venue. At the 1964 Daytona 500, Richard Petty piloted a Chrysler to victory in one of the most dominant performances the race had ever seen. The HEMI proved that it could handle sustained high-speed punishment that would have torn apart lesser engines. But it was on the drag strips where the 426 Hemi truly announced itself as a force of nature. At the 1964 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park, the Superstock Eliminator Final was an all-Hemi affair. Dodge Ram Chargers and related factory teams dominated the competition so thoroughly that people began to understand they weren't just witnessing a new engine, they were witnessing the birth of a new era. The early success was almost overwhelming. Factory teams, armed with these new engines and the backing of Chrysler's engineering department, began winning with a consistency that left competitors scrambling for answers. The Ram Chargers, a legendary team of Chrysler employees and racers, became synonymous with Hemi power. Their 1964 Dodge 330 Superstock, driven by Roger Lindemood in his famous Color Me Gone livery, defeated the favored Ram Chargers team itself in the Superstock Eliminator at the U.S. Nationals, a stunning upset that proved the Hemi's potential was as yet untapped. But the real story of the 426 Hemi wasn't just about raw power. It was about what that power meant for the future of drag racing. Within a year, Chrysler had introduced multiple variants of the Hemi for different racing categories. The Race Hemi for NHRA competition, the Track Hemi for NASCAR, and eventually, in 1966, the Street HEMI for production vehicles, allowing everyday enthusiasts to experience genuine Hemi power themselves. This three-pronged approach to engine development showed that Chrysler understood something fundamental. The best way to win in the marketplace was to win on the track and then sell that winning formula to the public. The 426 Hemi brought with it a level of engineering excellence that elevated the entire sport. It proved that thoughtful, sophisticated engine design could beat brute force. The hemispherical combustion chamber, when properly executed, delivered better fuel economy, lower emissions in some applications, and most importantly for racers, better power output. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. By 1965, the landscape of drag racing was shifting dramatically. The Hemi wasn't just winning, it was rewriting the rulebook. NHRA, seeing the dominance of Chrysler's factory effort, began tinkering with the rules, trying to level the playing field. They outlawed exotic metals like magnesium and aluminum in certain classes, attempting to slow down the Mopar juggernaut. But Chrysler's engineers and racers were always one step ahead. They would respond to every rule change with innovation, creating new strategies and approaches that kept the Hemi competitive regardless of what restrictions were imposed. One of the most significant developments in this early period came with the creation of what became known as package cars. Factory-built vehicles designed specifically for drag racing, equipped with specially tuned Hemi engines and featuring modifications that pushed the boundaries of what was legal. These weren't street cars that were modified for racing. These were purpose-built machines, assembled on the factory line, that were delivered to racing teams. The 1965 A990 package car, for instance, came equipped with a 426 Hemi, special cross-ram intake manifold with dual Holley carburetors and a variety of go-fast components. Famous racers like Ronnie Sox and Dick Landy piloted these machines, and they became icons of the era. The dominance of Chrysler's Hemi-powered vehicles became so complete that by the mid-1960s, if you wanted to win in Superstock or AFX categories, you needed a Hemi under the hood. The engine had transcended the realm of mere performance component. It had become a statement, a declaration that Chrysler understood the future of American motorsport better than anyone else. But the most radical chapter in the Hemi story was just beginning to unfold. In 1965, the Ram Chargers pushed boundaries in ways that would fundamentally alter the future of drag racing. Working with a 1965 Dodge Coronet, they made a revolutionary decision: move the wheels. Not just a little bit, they moved the front wheels and suspension forward 10 inches and the rear wheels and suspension forward 15 inches. This placed over 50% of the vehicle's weight on the rear wheels, creating an entirely different weight distribution than traditional drag racing machines. This alteration, combined with the Hemi engine, created something that NHRA officials took one look at and rejected outright. It was too radical. It broke too many unwritten rules. It didn't fit the profile of what a proper superstock car should look like. But the Ramchargers weren't interested in NHRA's blessing. They had the AHRA, the American Hot Rod Association, which was far more permissive. And beyond sanctioned racing, there was match racing, where individual racers and teams could agree to almost any configuration and race for purses that often exceeded what you could win in organized events. The altered wheelbase Coronet, powered by the 426 Hemi, became a weapon of unprecedented effectiveness. The car could accelerate with a violence that seemed to defy physics. It was winning by such wide margins, and doing so with such consistency, that it captured the imagination of drag racing fans across the nation. By mid-1965, the Ramchargers had squeezed enough power and performance out of their 472 cubic inch Hemi variant to run in the 8-second range for the quarter mile, a barrier that seemed almost mythical at the time. These weren't just fast times. These were times that suggested the entire sport was entering a new dimension of performance. And when the Ramchargers proved that a full-bodied, street-legal-looking Dodge could run in the 8s, the seed for the funny car was planted. The Hemi wasn't just pushing the boundaries of what an engine could do, it was pushing the boundaries of what an entire category of racing machine could become. Throughout the mid-1960s, NHRA continued to adjust its rulebook in attempts to manage the Hemi's dominance. New classes were created, new restrictions were implemented, and new specifications were mandated. But with each new regulation, Chrysler's engineers found ways to adapt and overcome. The 1967 Superstock season saw the introduction of one of the most iconic vehicles in drag racing history, the limited production Superstock package cars. The 1968 Dodge Dart and Plymouth Barracuda with 426 Hemi engines. These weren't concept cars or one-off race specials. These were production vehicles, built on the factory assembly line, with the massive Hemi engines installed at an off-site modification facility run by Hearst Performance Products. The cars were labor-intensive to build. The engine bay had to be extensively modified to accommodate the enormous Hemi. The rear wheel wells had to be trimmed for tire clearance. Unnecessary weight was stripped away. Rear seats, radios, and heaters were removed. What emerged was a machine that looked like a production Dodge Dart or Plymouth Barracuda, but was, in reality, a ground-pounding drag strip terror. Sox and Martin Racing took delivery of one of the 1968 Plymouth Hemi Barracudas and immediately went to war with it. The team, led by the legendary Ronnie Sox, piloted the machine to victory after victory. The highlight came at the 1968 NHRA Nationals, where the Hemi Barracuda won the Superstock Eliminator class in what became one of the most prestigious victories in drag racing history. But beyond the Superstock classes, something far more dramatic was unfolding in the realm of top fuel and nitromethane racing. By the mid-1960s, racers were beginning to understand that the 426 Hemi's architecture, that beautiful hemispherical combustion chamber and the deep skirt block, had potential far beyond what Chrysler's engineers had originally envisioned. The Hemi could be pushed, modified, and tuned in ways that opened entirely new performance frontiers. The man who would pioneer this territory was Don Garlits, a legendary drag racer and innovator who had been experimenting with various engine configurations and fuel types since the 1950s. Garlits understood that nitromethane, a fuel that had been banned from NHRA competition in 1958 but was still allowed in independent venues and the AHRA, could unlock performance levels that conventional gasoline engines simply couldn't achieve. Nitromethane burns much slower than gasoline, which means the combustion event extends further down the power stroke. This requires radically advanced ignition timing, sometimes advancing the spark lead to 75 degrees or more, compared to the 36 degrees typical for gasoline engines. With a standard engine, that level of ignition advance would cause catastrophic knock and detonation, but the 426 Hemi, with its superior combustion chamber geometry and structural rigidity, could handle it. Garlits began experimenting with Hemi engines in his dragsters, and what he discovered was nothing short of revolutionary. The Hemi didn't just survive extreme ignition timing on nitromethane, it thrived on it. The engine seemed to be designed by nature itself for this application. Throughout the late 1960s, Garlits and other top fuel pioneers began pushing the Hemi harder and harder. Displacement grew. Superchargers were added. Fuel systems became more sophisticated. The horsepower numbers climbed steadily upward. By the early 1970s, Hemi-powered dragsters were producing 800 horsepower, then 900 horsepower. The 1,000 horsepower barrier, a number that had seemed completely theoretical just a few years earlier, was coming into focus. This wasn't just engineering advancement. This was the dawning of a new era in motorsport. In 1973, Keith Black, one of the most respected engine builders in all of motorsport, took the Hemi concept in a revolutionary direction. Black had established his reputation building incredible engines for boat racing, but when Chrysler stopped production of iron Hemi blocks at the end of 1971, Black saw an opportunity. Working with Chrysler engineer Bob Tarozzi, Black began manufacturing Hemi blocks from aluminum. This single innovation changed everything for top fuel and funny car racing. The aluminum block saved over 100 pounds per engine compared to the iron version. That weight savings was transformative for dragster design, allowing for better weight distribution and improved acceleration. But there was more. The aluminum block was repairable. When a connecting rod let go, and in top fuel racing, it eventually does, the aluminum block could be welded and modified where an iron block would be scrap metal. Teams could rebuild their engines more economically. Performance could be pushed even further because the financial penalty for experimentation was reduced. The Keith Black aluminum Hemi block became the standard for top fuel and funny car racing almost immediately. Every major team wanted one. Teams would go to any length to get their hands on Black's engines. The dominance was absolute. Between 1974 and 1984, the Keith Black Hemi held every national record in top fuel. Don Garlits' Swamp Rat series, the legendary dragsters that had pioneered the rear-engine layout and continued to evolve with every competition, became synonymous with Hemi power. Garlits set the 250 miles per hour barrier in 1965, and throughout the following 2 decades, he and other Hemi-powered teams continued to push the boundaries of what seemed possible. By the late 1970s, Hemi-powered top-fuel dragsters were consistently producing 1,000 horsepower on nitromethane fuel. This wasn't a theoretical number anymore. This was reality. Teams were regularly testing their engines and documenting power figures that exceeded 1,000 horsepower. Some of the most advanced Hemi engines were making well over 1,200 horsepower. The progression from the original 426 Hemi's 500-plus horsepower in its 1964 form to the 1,000-plus horsepower monsters of the 1970s represented one of the most dramatic performance escalations in the history of internal combustion. What made this achievement even more remarkable was the fact that the fundamental architecture, that hemispherical combustion chamber and deep skirt block design that Tom Hoover's team had conceived in December 1962, remained at the core of these incredible power plants. Engineers had refined every detail. They had optimized intake and exhaust ports. They had developed sophisticated fuel injection systems. They had mastered ignition timing strategies. They had created valve trains that could withstand forces that would have destroyed engines from just a decade earlier. But the basic genius of the original design remained. By the 1980s and beyond, the Hemi's dominance had transcended drag racing entirely. The basic architecture was adopted for use in funny cars, where top-level competitors were pushing these engines to 1,500 horsepower on nitromethane. The engine that had been created to help Chrysler compete with Pontiac on drag strips across America had become the foundation of the fastest accelerating vehicles on Earth. Every top-fuel dragster running today carries the genetic code of that 1962 engineering mandate. The evolution from the 426 Hemi's debut in 1964 to the modern era represents more than just a story of increasing horsepower numbers. It represents a fundamental truth about innovation in motorsport. Sometimes the best designs are those that anticipate not just the present, but the future. Tom Hoover and his team didn't just create an engine for 1964 drag racing. They created a foundation that could be built upon, modified, refined, and pushed in directions they could never have imagined when they first conceived the idea of marrying a Hemi head with a max wedge block. The 1,000 horsepower milestone was just one chapter in this ongoing story. As drag racing continued to evolve, the Hemi continued to evolve with it. Displacement records were set, then broken. Fuel mixtures were experimented with. Supercharger technology advanced from mechanical roots blowers to modern twin-screw designs that moved enormous quantities of air and fuel into those magnificent hemispherical combustion chambers. The engine that had begun its life as Chrysler's answer to Pontiac's dominance had become the beating heart of the fastest accelerating vehicles in human history. When you stand in the pits at an NHRA event today and watch the Top Fuel dragsters stage, those machines are the direct descendants of that 426 Hemi concept. That hemispherical combustion chamber, now machined from aerospace-grade aluminum alloys and fitted with titanium valves and carbon fiber components, is still the same elegant geometry that Hoover's team understood would be superior to any wedge design. The deep skirt block may be billet aluminum now, with 12,000 horsepower flowing through it at nearly 10,000 RPM, but its architecture traces directly back to that 1962 mandate. The birth of the 1,000 horsepower engine wasn't a single moment. It was a process of continuous improvement, bold experimentation, and engineering excellence that began with a simple question: what if we could make a better engine for drag racing? The answer turned out to be far more profound than anyone anticipated. It fundamentally changed not just Chrysler's racing fortunes, but the entire trajectory of drag racing itself, creating a lineage of performance that continues to this day and continues to push the boundaries of what internal combustion can achieve.